All right, welcome. This module is called Host and Management Scalability. This is a module that covers a wide variety of topics that are centrally managed concepts, right? That's why they're called scalability, but they cover a variety of areas in the vSphere administration that cover host management as well as vCenter management and VM management. So quite a few different categories to look through here. In fact, first of all, we need to be mindful of the fact that we need to be able to scale our environment effectively. We need to understand the management and functions that help us manage our host and environment in terms of a centralized perspective. So that involves a variety of different areas that cover things like security, administration, and configuration. So let's see here. We have, first of all, certificate management. So we need to be mindful of how we can go ahead and manage certificates in vSphere. There's actually a really nice new way of doing this in vSphere 7. We'll take a look at a new feature also introduced in vSphere 7 called the vCenter Server Identity Federation, and also another new feature called the vSphere Trust Authority for setting up a hardware root of trust for your vSphere environment. And then we'll also take a look at host profiles to centrally manage the configuration of ESXi hosts. Then content libraries, a central way to manage your images of your virtual machines. And then finally, resource pools, a centralized way to manage CPU memory resources in a cluster. So lots of different things to take a look at. Let's dive right into our first lesson, the VMware certificate management concept. And so here's the objectives. Basically, we should be able to understand at this point that there is actually in vSphere a brand new, I should say not a brand new, a certificate management system called the VMware Certificate Authority, right? So there is a certificate authority built into vCenter. It's new that it's in vCenter. It used to be separate on another system called the Platform Service Controller in vSphere 6. But in vSphere 7, the Platform Service Controller is gone. And so all the services that are typically running in the Platform Service Controller are now part of vCenter. So we'll take a look at what the Certificate Authority is. Also a service that runs on vCenter, formerly running on the Platform Service Controller, is something known as the VMware Endpoint Certificate Store, also known as VEX. That's a place that we store certificate information. We'll also have an understanding of a few different components of the VMware certificate management environment, which involves things like solution users and their certificate requirements, machine certificates, and so on. And also worth noting, the VMware Certificate Authority has different modes it can run in. It has its default mode, but it also has a couple other optional modes that you might need to configure. And then show you the most commonly implemented method we'll show you with using the user interface. That basically means if we ever needed to replace certificates, what's the process, right? So there is a certificate authority that is built into vSphere, but also if you wanted to use a certificate authority that your environment trusts, well, then you'll use your own internal enterprise CA in some fashion in conjunction with the VMware certificate authority. So we'll show you the processes and the modes in which you can set that certificate authority to work with your environment. And lastly, what's new to vSphere 7 as it relates to certificates is that the certificate management process is now centrally managed using the vSphere client, where in the previous version of vSphere, it was primarily handled using command line tools. So what's this whole business of certificates in the first place, right? Every connection between our vSphere client and vSphere components, whether it's the vSphere client connected to vCenter, or the host client connecting to ESXi hosts, or if it's from vCenter connecting to the hosts, or even internal communications within vCenter server itself, it's all encrypted using what we generally refer to as SSL encryption, right? It's now using TLS as the protocol for doing all this, but we generally refer to this communications of encryption over SSL. And right, one of the foundations of SSL is that if we're going to establish an encrypted connection between environments, we'd want to ensure that the identity of the system that we're communicating with is trusted. So how do we do that? Any system that is to be establishing an encrypted connection will also have a certificate to identify itself. That certificate is then signed, typically by a third party, that the browser that you're using already is aware of. For instance, you have your certificate authorities on the internet that anytime you connect to a website that requires your credit card, it's going to be encrypted. So your browser will establish the trust of the connection and the identity of your server that you're trying to provide your credit card with a known certificate authority on the internet. Well, a lot of times in corporate environments, you'll have your own internal corporate certificate authority instead. So any case, if your browser trusts either the internet certificate authority or your own corporate certificate authority, then when you try to establish connection with those systems, the browser just happily connects right in and creates an encrypted channel, which is great. If, on the other hand, the certificate authority that is establishing the certificates is not trusted by your browser, then you get this message, right? The classic, there is a problem with the website's security certificate, right? If the certificate authority actually signs their own certificate, right? Self-signed certificates, kind of like walking around with, kind of like a fake ID. You're claiming the website, the VMware certificate authority is claiming they are who they are, and your browser isn't going to natively trust them. Now, ways of making this work, you can actually go ahead and get the certificate from the VMware certificate authority and then import it into your browser. And that may be fine for some admins, that if you only have a few dozen admins, or maybe not even that many admins, having them manually import the VMware certificates into their browsers would basically remove this certificate verification warning message. However, if you have a good number of people trying to log into vCenter, it may be simpler to actually have the certificates in your vCenter system to be replaced instead with certificates that your environment does trust. So maybe you do have a corporate certificate authority that could generate certificates that could be placed in your VMware environment. This is the neat thing about having a certificate authority built into vCenter, is that it can work with your corporate certificate authority in a couple different ways to make this a more simpler process. So we'll take a look at what are the different options that we have available for setting up that trusted configuration. So we already mentioned certificate authorities. There's a plethora of them on the internet, right? You have commercial certificate authorities that can charge, they'll charge to issue certificates. Community certificate authorities like cacert.org will potentially provide free certificates. Some organizations may act as their own certificate authority and issue their own self-signed certificates, right? And that's basically what the VMCA is, right? The VMware Certificate Authority is its own self-signing certificate. And that's why your browser won't trust it natively. So to trust a certificate signed by a CA, clients typically as web browsers will have the CA's root certificate installed. You'll do that to make the browser trust that certificate authority. Now, some cases, if it's a corporate CA, then having your browser trust what your host OS that the browser runs on, if your host OS trusts your corporate CA, then the browser will typically trust that. That's the case for some browsers. In the case of Firefox, that actually isn't the case. You would actually have to go ahead and add that manually into the set of trusted certificates in your Firefox browser, which is actually the browser we end up using in the lab. And so you actually see us replace the certificate, and in the end, it actually doesn't actually solve anything because our Firefox browser doesn't trust anything generated by our own internal corporate CA. If we were using a different browser that the browser actually trusts what the OS it runs on trusts, then this would actually be probably even more compelling. But in any case, you can manually add your certificates into your browsers if you need to, but in some cases, depending on the browser you use, may actually trust certificates that were from a certificate authority that your OS has already built in trust with. So that's our brief introduction to this concept. What we'll do is we'll break this up into a couple different sections. So we'll take a quick break and dive into a little bit more on the VMware CA and some of the different components that make up the certificate management in vCenter after we take a quick break. So we'll see you in a few minutes.